communication device. So I shall wait for you to rejoin me over here, if you will. I don't know where I left off. Those of you who were interrupted on the stream, if you could maybe tell me a little bit of where I left off, I would greatly appreciate it. Hello, darling. Sorry, I was off. Hello. Sorry, technical difficulties. Welcome back. Can you please tell me where I was kicked off of the internet? Someone in the chat, tell me what was the last thing you heard, please. I shall just wait a moment so that we can recoup, where we can refigure where we are. Let me see. Hello, Sandy. I was reading Christmas ghost stories. I was kicked off. Okay. Well, I'll go back, and if you hear that I already read that part, about a page back. Okay. Well, I shall go back then. I'll go back about a page. Hester, keep her from that child. It will lure her to her death. That evil child. Tell her it's a wicked, naughty child. Then Mrs. Stark hurried me out of the room, where indeed I was glad enough to go. But Miss Furnivall kept shrieking out, "Oh, have mercy! Wilt thou never forgive? It is many a long year ago." I was very uneasy in my mind after that. I durst never leave Miss Rosamond night or day, for fear she might slip off again, after some fancy or another. And all the more because I thought I could make out that Miss Furnivall was crazy from their odd ways about her, and I was afraid lest something of the same kind, which might be in the family, you know, hung over my darling. And the great frost never ceased all this time, and whenever it was a more stormy night than usual, between the gusts and through the wind, we heard the old lord playing on the great organ. But old lord or not, wherever Miss Rosamond went, there I followed, for my love for her pretty, helpless orphan was stronger than my fear of the grand and terrible sound. Besides, it rested with me to keep her cheerful and merry, as beseemed her age. So we played together, and wandered together, here and there and everywhere, for I never dared to lose sight of her again in that large and rambling house. And so it happened that one afternoon, not long before Christmas Day, we were playing together on the billiard table in the great hall. Not that we knew the right way to play, but she liked to roll the smooth ivory balls with her pretty hands, and I liked to do whatever she did. And by, without our noticing it, it grew dusk indoors, though it was still light in the open air, and I was thinking of taking her back to the nursery when all of a sudden she cried out, "Look, Hester, there's my poor little girl out in the snow." I turned towards the long, narrow windows, and there, sure enough, I saw a little girl, less than Miss Rosamond, dressed all unfit to be out of doors on such a bitter night, crying and beating against the window panes, as if she wanted to be let in. She seemed to sob and wail, till Miss Rosamond could bear it no longer, and was flying in the door to open it, when, all of a sudden, and close upon us, the great organ pealed out so loud and thundering, it fairly made me tremble, and all the more when I remembered that even in the stillness of the dead cold weather, I had heard no sound of little batting hands upon the window glass, although the phantom child had seemed to put forth all its force, and although I had seen it wail and cry, no faintest touch of sound had fallen upon my ears. Whether I remembered all this At the very moment, I do not know. The great organ sound had so stunned me into terror. But this I know, I caught up Miss Rosamond before she, I caught up Miss Rosamond before she got to the hall door opened, and clutched her, and carried her away, kicking and screaming, into the large, bright kitchen, where Dorothy and Agnes were busy with their mince pies. "What's the matter with my sweet one?" cried Dorothy, as I bore in Miss Rosamond, who was sobbing as if her heart would break. "She won't let me open the door for my little girl to come in, and she'll die if she's out in the fells at night. Cruel, naughty Hester," she said, slapping me. But she might have struck harder, for I had seen a look of ghastly terror on Dorothy's face which made my very blood run cold. "Shut the back kitchen door fast, and bolt it well," said she to Agnes. She said no more. She gave me raisins and almonds to quiet Miss Rosamond, but she sobbed about the little girl in the snow, and would not touch any of the good things. I was thankful when she cried herself to sleep in bed. Then I stole down to the kitchen and told Dorothy I had made up my mind I would carry my darling back to my father's house in Applewaite, where, if we lived humbly, we lived at peace. I said I had been frightened enough with the old lord's organ playing, but now that I had seen for myself this little moaning child, all decked out as no child in the neighbourhood could be, beating and battering to get in, yet always without any sound or noise, with a dark wound on its right shoulder, and that Miss Rosamond had known it again for the phantom that had nearly lured her to her death, which Dorothy knew was true. I would stand it no longer. I saw Dorothy change colour once or twice. When I had done, she told me she did not think I could take Miss Rosamond with me, for that she was my lord's ward, and I had no right over her, and she asked me, would I leave that child that I was so fond of, just for sounds and sights that could do me no harm, and that they had all had to get used to in their turns? I was all in a hot, trembling passion, and I said that it was very well for her to talk, that knew what these sights and noises betokened, and that had perhaps had something to do with the spectre child while it was alive, and I taunted her so, that she told me all she knew at last. And then I wished I had never been told, for it only made me more afraid than ever. She said she had heard the tale from old neighbours that were alive when she was first married, when folks used to come up to the hall sometimes, before it had got such a bad name on the countryside. It might not be true, or might, what she had been told. The old lord was Miss Furnivall's father, Miss Grace, as Dorothy called her, for Miss Maud was the elder, and Miss Furnivall by rights. The old lord was eaten up with pride. Such a proud man was never seen or heard of, and his daughters were like him. No one was good enough to wed them, although they had choice enough, for they were the great beauties of their day, as I had seen by their portraits, where they hung in the state drawing-room. But as the old saying is, pride will have a fall, and these two haughty beauties fell in love with the same man, and he no better than a foreign musician, whom their father had down from London to play music with him at the manor house. For above all things, next to his pride, the lord loved music. He could play on nearly every instrument that ever was heard of, and it was a strange thing, it did not soften him. But he was a fierce, dour old man, and had broken his poor wife's heart with his cruelty. They said he was mad after music, and would pay any money for it, so he got this foreigner to come, who made such beautiful music that they said the very birds on the trees stopped their singing to listen. And, by degrees, this foreign gentleman got such a hold over the old lord that nothing would serve him but that he must come every year. And it was he that had the great organ brought from Holland and built up in the hall. There it stood now, the taught old lord to play on it. but many and many a time when Lord Furnivall was thinking of nothing but his fine organ and his finer music. The dark foreigner was walking abroad in the woods with one of the young ladies, now Miss Maud, and then Miss Grace. Miss Maud won the day and carried off the prize, such as it was, and he and she were married all unknown to anyone, and before he made his next yearly visit. She had been confined of a little girl of a farmhouse on the moors, while her father and Miss Grace thought she was away at Doncaster races. But though she was a wife and a mother, she was not a bit softened, but as haughty and as passionate as ever, and perhaps more so, for she was jealous of Miss Grace, to whom her foreign husband paid a deal of court, by the way of blinding her, as he told his wife. But Miss Grace triumphed over Miss Maud, and Miss Maud grew fiercer and fiercer, both with her husband and with her sister, and the former, who could easily shake off what was disagreeable and hide himself in foreign countries, went away a month before his usual time that summer, and half threatened that he would never come back again. Meanwhile, the little girl was left at the farmhouse, and her mother used to have her horse saddled and galloped wildly over the hills to see her once every week at the very least. For where she loved, and where she hated, and the old lord went on playing on his organ, and his servants thought the sweet music he made had soothed down his awful temper, of which Dorothy said some terrible tales could be told. He grew infirm too, and had to walk with a crutch, and his son, that was the present Lord Furnivall's father, was with the army in America, and the other son at sea, so Miss Maud had it pretty much her own way, and she and Miss Grace grew colder and bitterer to each other every day, till at last they hardly ever spoke, except when the old lord was by. The foreign music came again the next summer, but it was for the last time, for they had led him such a life with their jealousy and their passions that he grew weary and went away, and never was heard of again. And Miss Maud, who had always meant to have her marriage acknowledged when her father should be dead, was left now a deserted wife, whom nobody knew to have been married, with a child that she dared not own, although she loved it to a distraction, living with a father whom she feared and a sister whom she hated. When the next summer passed over and the dark foreigner never came, both Miss Maud and Miss Grace grew gloomy and sad. They had a haggard look about them, though they looked handsome as ever, but by and by Miss Maud brightened, for her father grew more and more infirm, and more than ever carried away by his music, and she and Miss Grace lived almost entirely apart, having separate rooms, the one on the west side, Miss Maud on the east side. Those very rooms which were now shut up, so she thought she might have her little girl with her, and no one need ever know except those who dared not speak about it, and were bound to believe that it was, as she said, a cottager's child she had taken a fancy to. All this, Dorothy said, was pretty well known, but what came afterwards no one knew except Miss Grace and Mrs. Stark, who was even then her maid, and much more of a friend to her than even her sister had ever been. But the servants supposed, from my words that were dropped, that Miss Maud had triumphed over Miss Grace, and told her that all the time the dark foreigner had been mocking her with pretended love. He was her own husband. The colour left Miss Grace's cheek and lips that very day forever, and she was heard to say many a time that sooner or later she would have revenge, and Mrs. Stark was forever spying about the east rooms. One fearful night, just after the new year had come in, when the snow was lying thick on the deep, and the flakes were still falling fast enough to blind anyone who might be out and abroad, there was a great and violent noise heard, and the old lord's voice above all, cursing and swearing awfully, and the cries of the little child, and the proud defiance of a fierce woman, and the sound of a blow, and a dead stillness, and moans and wailings dying away in the hillside. Then the old lord summoned all his servants, and told them, with terrible oaths, and words more terrible, that his daughter had disgraced herself, and that he had turned her out of the doors, her and her child, and that if ever they gave her help, or food, or shelter, he prayed that they might never enter heaven, and all the while Miss Grace stood by him, white and still as any stone, and when he had ended, she heaved a great sigh, as much as to say her work was done, and her end was accomplished. But the old lord never touched his organ. But the old lord never touched his organ again. I think it's 2 pages, but not. The old lord never touched his organ again, and died within the year, and no wonder. For on the morrow of that wild and fearful night, the shepherds coming down the fell side found Miss Maud sitting all crazy and smiling under the holly trees, nursing a dead child, with a terrible mark on its right shoulder. But that was not what killed it, said Dorothy. It was the frost and the cold. Every wild creature was in its hole, and every beast in its fold, while the child and its mother were turned out to wander on the fells. And now you know all, and I wonder if you are less frightened now. I was more frightened than ever, but I said I was not. I wished Miss Rosamond and myself well out of that dreadful house forever, but I would not leave her, and I dared not take her away. But oh, how I watched her, and guarded her. We bolted the doors and shut the windows, shut us fast, an hour or more before dark, rather than leave them open 5 minutes too late. But my little lady still heard the weird child crying and mourning, and not all we could do or say could keep her from wanting to go to her and let her in from the cruel wind and the snow. All this time I kept away from Miss Furnivall and Miss Stark as much as ever I could, for I feared them. I knew no good could come about them, with their grey, hard faces and their dreamy eyes looking back into the ghastly years that were gone. But even in my fear, I had a kind of pity for Miss Furnivall, at least. Those gone down to the pit can hardly have more hopeless look than that which was ever on her face. At last, I even got so sorry for her, who never said a word but was quite forced from her, that I prayed for her. And I taught Miss Rosamond to pray for one for who had done a deadly sin, but often, when she came to those words, she would listen and start up from her knees and say, "I hear my little girl playing and crying and very sad. Oh, let her in, or she will die." One night, just after New Year's Day, had come at last. The long winter had taken a turn, as I hoped. I heard the west drawing-room bell ring 3 times, which was the signal for me. I would not leave Miss Rosamond alone, for all she was asleep, for the old lord had been playing wilder than ever, and I feared lest my darling should waken to hear the spectre child, see her. I knew she could not. I fastened the windows too well for that. So I took her out of the bed and wrapped her up in such outer clothes as were most handy, and carried her down to the drawing-room, where the old ladies sat in their tapestry work as usual. They looked up when I came in, and Mrs. Stark asked, quite astonished, "Why did I bring Miss Rosamond there, out of her warm bed?" I had begun to whisper, because I was afraid of her being tempted out while I was away by the wild child in the snow, when she stopped me short with a glance at Miss Furnivall, and said Miss Furnivall wanted me to undo some work she had done wrong, and which neither of them could see to unpick. So I laid my pretty dear one on the sofa, and sat down on a stool by them, and hardened my heart against them as I heard the wind rising and howling. Miss Rosamond slept on sound, for all the wind blew so, and Miss Furnivall said never a word, nor looked round when the gusts shook the window. All at once she started up for her full height, and put up one hand as if to bid us listen. "I hear voices," she said. "I hear terrible screams. I hear my father's voice." Just at that moment my darling wakened with a sudden start. "My little girl is crying. Oh, how she is crying." And she tried to get up and go to her, but she got her feet entangled in the blanket, and I caught her up, for my flesh had begun to creep for those noises which they heard, while we could catch no sound. In a minute or two the noises came, and gathered fast, and filled our ears. We too heard voices and screams, and no longer heard the winter's wind that raged abroad. Mrs. Stark looked at me, and I at her, but we dared not speak. Suddenly Miss Furnivall went towards the door, but into the ante-room, through the west lobby, and opened the door into the great hall. Mrs. Stark followed, and I durst not be left, though my heart almost stopped beating for fear. I wrapped my darling tight in my arms, and went out with them. In the hall the screams were louder than ever. They sounded to come from the east wing, nearer and nearer, close on the other side of locked-up doors, close behind them. Then I noticed the great bronze chandelier seemed all alight, though the hall was dim, and that the fire was blazing in the vast hearth-place, though it gave no heat. And I shuddered. I shuddered up with terror, and folded my darling closer to me. But as I did so, the east door shook, and she, suddenly struggling to get free from me, cried, "Hester, I must go. My little girl is there. I hear her. She is coming, Hester. I must go." I held her tight with all my strength. With a set will, I held her. If I had died, my hands would have grasped her still. I was so resolved in my mind. Miss Furnivall stood listening, and paid no regard to my darling, who had got down to the ground, and whom I, upon my knees now, was holding with both my arms clasped around her neck. She still striving and crying to get free. All at once the east door gave way with a thundering crash, as if torn open in a violent passion, and there came into that broad and mysterious light the figure of a tall, old man with grey hair and gleaming eyes. He drove before him, with many relentless gesture of abhorrence, a stern and beautiful woman with a little child clinging to her dress. "Oh, Hester, Hester," cried Miss Rosamond, "it's the lady below the holly trees, and my little girl is with her. Hester, Hester, let me go to her. They are drawing me to them. I feel them, I must go." Again she was almost convulsed by her efforts to get away, but I held her tighter and tighter, till I feared I should do her a hurt, but rather that than let her go towards those terrible phantoms. They passed along toward the great hall door, where the winds howled and ravened for their prey. But before they reached that, the lady turned, and I could see that she defied the old man with a fierce and proud defiance. But then she quailed, and then she threw her arms wildly and piteously to save her child, her little child, from a blow from his uplifted crutch. And Miss Rosamond was torn as by the power stronger than mine, and writhed in my arms and sobbed, for by this time the poor darling was growing faint. "They want me to go with them on the fells. They are just drawing me to them. Oh, my little girl, I would come, but cruel, wicked Hester holds me very tight." But when she saw the uplifted crutch, she swooned away, and I thanked God for it. Just at this moment, when the tall old man's his hair, streaming as in the blast of a furnace, was going to strike the little shrieking child, Miss Furnivall, the old woman by my side, cried out, "Oh, Father, Father, spare the little innocent child." But just then we all saw, another phantom shape itself and grow clear out of the blue and misty light that filled the hall. We had not seen her till now, for it was another lady who stood by the old man with a look of relentless hate and triumphant scorn. That figure was very beautiful to look upon, with soft white hat drawn down over the proud brows, and a red and curling lip, that was dressed in the open robe of blue satin. I had seen that figure before. It was the likeness of Miss Furnivall in her youth, and the terrible phantoms moved on, regardless of old Miss Furnivall's wild entreaty, and the uplifted crutch fell upon the right shoulder of the little girl, and the younger sister looked on, stony and deadly serene. But at that moment, the dim lights and the fire that gave no heat went out of themselves, and Miss Furnivall lay at our feet, stricken down the palsy, death-stricken. Yes, she carried to her bed that night, never to rise again. She lay with her face to the wall, muttering low, but muttering always, "Alas, alas, what is done in youth can never be undone in age. What is done in youth can never be undone in age." Did you like that story? I liked that story. That was a good story. Should we end there? I think I might end here. I have a little bit of a tickle. Anyway, my darlings, if you're enjoying this, I will continue next week. Why not? I think next week I shall continue because I have a little tickle to the throat. I have been reading aloud all day, and my vocal cords are rather tired. Anyway, my loves, thank you for everything. Thank you for joining me. Thank you for rejoining me. Thank you to my patrons. Check me out on The Gentleman's House under Patreon. You can also leave one-time gifts if you feel so inclined and it does not harm you. If you're not putting... If this content brings you joy and you can leave one-time gifts at my PayPal, rlillard6@gmail.com. You can find me on Venmo under Richard-Lael Lillard. Only if you can. If you can't, I appreciate you and I thank you. Just make certain to hit the likes, the comments, the shares. That helps me out tremendously too. And with that, if I don't see you before Christmas time, if I don't see you before the 25th, I appreciate you, I love you, and I shall speak with you another time. Have a good night, my beauties. Take care.